Elias is a man the world has forgotten. A former trauma medic turned homeless veteran living under a bridge in a bustling coastal city. His life is a rhythmic struggle for survival until one stormy night when he plunges into the freezing black currents to pull a young woman, Hannah, from a sinking car. Unbeknownst to him, Hannah isn't just any socialite. She is the ice princess of the Kong Syndicate. After ensuring she's breathing, Elias disappears back in the shadows, wanting no reward, but leaving behind a small, weathered medic's pouch that belonged to his late daughter. The middle of the story follows a tense cat-and-mouse game. Hannah, moved by the selfless bravery of a man who had every reason to ignore her, uses her family's vast resources to track him down, not for vengeance, but for a debt of honor. However, her father, the ruthless Chairman Kong, initially views Elias as a security threat or a witness who knows too much. As Elias is drawn into their world of opulence and danger, he refuses their money, choosing instead to challenge their morality. A bond forms between the hardened veteran and the sheltered heiress, built on invisible threads of shared grief. The climax shifts from a story of gratitude to one of ultimate sacrifice and a staggering reveal. When an internal coup threatens the Kong family, the homeless man is the only one with the tactical skills and heart to save them. The final chapters reveal that Elias's presence in that city wasn't accidental, and his connection to the Kong family goes back decades to a forgotten act of mercy during a war. The story concludes not just with Elias's life being transformed, but with him transforming the very nature of the MAFIA into a foundation for community, proving that a coat doesn't define a man's soul. The black water of the Han River didn't just feel cold. It felt heavy, like liquid iron pressing against Elias's lungs. Below the surface, the world was a silent, murky tomb. Through the distorted glass of the sinking luxury sedan, he saw her, a young woman with hair like silk floating in a halo of terror. Her palms were pressed against a window, her silent screams dissolving into silver bubbles. Elias swung the jagged piece of rebar he'd scavenged from the riverbank. The first strike was swallowed by the pressure. The second sent a vibration through his frozen marrow. On the third, the glass imploded. The river roared into the cabin, a hungry beast claiming its prize. But Elias was faster. He reached through the shards, his callous hands catching the fine fabric of her coat. With a rhythmic, desperate kick, he hauled her upward, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Not this time. Not again. They broke the surface in a gasp of icy spray. Elias dragged her toward the muddy bank, the rain lashing down in sheets that blurred the neon skyline of Seoul. He collapsed on the silt, his chest heaving as he rolled her onto her side. He pumped her chest with the practiced precision of a man who had once worn a different uniform, until finally she coughed, a jagged, life-giving sound. In the distance, the first wail of the siren cut through the storm. Blue and red lights began to dance off the underside of the bridge. Elias stood, his wet clothes clinging to his gaunt frame like a second skin. He couldn't be here. The shadows were his only protection. Without a word, he turned and melted into the darkness of the underpass, his silhouette swallowed by the rain before the first paramedic could reach the shore. It was only when he reached the hollow concrete pipe he called home that he reached into his inner pocket for comfort. His fingers met nothing but damp fabric. The small, weathered leather pouch, the one containing the only photograph of his daughter and his final medal of valor, was gone. He looked back at the river, his breath hitching. The memento that defined his past was now in the hands of the girl he had just snatched from death. The steady, rhythmic hum of a heart monitor was the first sound to pierce the fog of Hannah's consciousness. It was too clean, too sterile. The scent of antiseptic replaced the metallic tang of the river water that had nearly filled her lungs. As her eyes fluttered open, the harsh fluorescent lights of the VIP suite stung, reflecting off the polished marble floors and the stoic, black-suited men stationed at the door. She tried to sit up, a sharp pain blooming in her chest, a reminder of the forceful, desperate life-saving breaths that had brought her back. Her hand went instinctively to the bedside table, but it wasn't her phone she was looking for. Her mind was trapped in the dark current, anchored to a pair of steady, callous hands and eyes that held a depth of kindness she had never seen in her father's world of silk and steel. "The man," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "Where is he?" The guards didn't blink. They stood like statues, their earpieces glinting. Hannah closed her eyes, trying to sharpen the blurry image in her mind. He hadn't looked like the people she knew. He was a man of the shadows, with skin deepened by the sun and hands scarred by a life of labor. He hadn't asked for her name. He hadn't waited for cameras. He had simply plucked her from the jaws of the abyss and vanished like a ghost into the rain. On the table beside her lay a small, damp leather pouch. It was the only thing the divers had recovered from the back seat of her car. She reached for it, her fingers trembling as she felt the weathered grain of the leather. It felt heavy with a history she didn't yet understand. The heavy double doors swung open with a resounding thud. The guards straightened, their heads bowing in unison. Chairman Kong stepped into the room, his long wool coat billowing behind him. He didn't offer a hug or a word of comfort. He stood at the foot of the bed, his gaze fixed on the muddy pouch in Hannah's hand, his expression unreadable and cold. "He was not one of ours," the chairman said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated through the room. He turned to his lead investigator, his eyes narrowing into slits. "Find him. He has seen our faces, and he carries a debt that only blood or gold can settle." The search did not begin in the neon-lit districts of Gangnam, but in the places the city tried to forget. Under the screeching iron of the subway tracks and within the damp labyrinth of the riverfront slums, Chairman Kang's lead investigator, a man named Min, moved like a shark through shallow water. His polished Oxfords were soon caked in the gray mud of the shantytowns, a stark contrast to the desperate poverty surrounding him. Min showed a grainy sketch to a group of elderly men huddled around a burning charcoal barrel. Most spat on the ground and turned away, their silence a shield against the world of the powerful. But in a flickering alleyway behind a closed fish market, a young runaway paused. The boy's feverish eyes widened as he looked at the description of the man with the steady hands and the quiet strength. "The ghost," the boy whispered, his voice trembling with a mix of awe and fear. "He doesn't talk much. He just appears when the coughing gets too loud, or the wounds won't close. He has medicine that smells like the old world, and he never asks for a single one. He's a saint who lives in the dirt." The trail led men deeper into the bowels of a condemned warehouse district, a place where the concrete seemed to weep with age. In a corner tucked away from the wind, he found a makeshift bed of flattened cardboard and a single, neatly folded wool blanket. There was no gold here, no stolen electronics, only the lingering scent of ozone and cheap antiseptic. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard near the pallet, Min's gloved fingers brushed against something hard and metallic. He pulled out a secondary, smaller satchel, one that had been tucked away for safekeeping. As he unzipped the heavy canvas, the breath caught in his throat. It wasn't just a first aid kit. Nestled inside, wrapped in a tattered American flag, were rows of heavy silver and bronze discs. As Min tilted them toward the dim light, the dark red stains of old, dry blood clotted the ribbons of elite military medals, honors for valor that a man like Elias should never have been carrying in a gutter. Hannah couldn't wait for the investigators to bring her a name. The weight of the leather pouch she had recovered felt like a burning coal against her skin, a debt of life that her father's money could never settle. She traded her designer silks for a frayed, oversized hoodie and a worn baseball cap, slipping past her guards to a service elevator. She needed to see the ghost for herself, away from the sterile glare of the hospital and the cold calculations of the syndicate. The air at the St. Jude soup kitchen was thick with the smell of cheap broth and unwashed bodies. Steam billowed from metal vats, clouding the faces of the desperate men and women who stood in a line that snaked around the block. Hannah kept her head down, her heart racing as she scanned the crowd. Then she saw him. He stood at the very end of the line, his frame tall and weary, yet possessing a stillness that commanded the space around him. When he finally reached the front, the volunteer handed him a single plastic bowl of thin stew and a heel of bread. Elias didn't eat. He walked to the edge of the alley where a mangy, shivering stray dog huddled against a dumpster. Without a moment's hesitation, Elias knelt in the dirt, placing the bowl before the creature. He watched with a faint, ghostly smile as the dog inhaled the food, his own stomach audibly growling in the silence of the corner. He had nothing, yet he gave everything. Hannah took a step toward him, her breath catching in her throat, but the moment was shattered by a low, rhythmic clicking of heels on pavement. 3 men in sharp, silver-gray suits, the signature color of the Hanguk faction, her father's bitterest rivals, stepped out from the shadows of a parked van. They weren't looking at the homeless. They were looking at the girl in the oversized hoodie. The Ice Princess has left her palace, the lead man sneered, his hand sliding slowly into his jacket toward the concealed hilt of a blade. The chairman will pay a king's ransom to get his daughter back in one piece, or several. Hannah froze, the cold reality of her world crashing into the sanctity of the breadline. As the men closed in, the ghost slowly stood up from the dirt, his kind eyes hardening into something sharp, ancient, and incredibly dangerous. The silver-suited men moved with the practiced aggression of predators who had never been told no. The lead attacker lunged, his hand flashing with the cold glint of a switchblade, aimed squarely for Hannah's arm. She braced for the impact, her breath hitching as the world slowed to a crawl. But the impact never came. With a blurred motion that defied his ragged appearance, Elias stepped into the line of fire. He didn't use a gun or a blade. In his left hand, he gripped the heavy plastic tray from the soup kitchen. In his right, the long-handled stainless steel ladle he had been using to serve the dog. The first attacker's wrist met the edge of the tray with a sickening crack. The knife clattered to the pavement before the man could even scream. Without breaking his stride, Elias swung the ladle in a tight, lethal arc, the heavy bulb of the metal catching the second man in the temple. The third man pulled a firearm, but Elias was already inside his guard. He used the tray as a tactical shield, slamming it into the man's throat and following through a precise strike to the solar plexus. It was a masterclass in violence. Not the messy brawl of a street sleeper, but the surgical neutralization of a high-tier operator. In less than 10 seconds, 3 of the Hanguk faction's finest enforcers lay groaning in the oily puddles of the alleyway. The ghost stood over them, his chest rising and falling in a steady, controlled rhythm. The cheap plastic tray still held like a Spartan's aegis. Hannah stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. The sirens of her own security detail finally wailed in the distance, their black SUVs skidding around the corner, but her eyes never left the man in the tattered coat. The kindness she had seen moments ago was gone, replaced by a haunting, hollow stillness that terrified her more than the assassins had. "Who are you?" Hannah whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of gratitude and dawning realization. "How could a man like you do that?" Elias didn't answer. He dropped the dented plastic tray into the trash, tucked his scarred hands into his pockets, and turned his back on the heiress. He melted into the gathering fog of the slums, a shadow returning to the dark, leaving her standing alone in the rain. Inside the dimly lit war room of the Kong estate, the air was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and cold tension. On a wall of high-definition monitors, the grainy footage from the soup kitchen security camera played on a loop. Chairman Kong sat in a throne-like leather chair, his fingers steepled as he watched the man in the tattered coat move. He didn't see a homeless man. He saw a ghost of a soldier, a specter who used a common soup ladle with the lethal efficiency of a scalpel. "Again," the chairman commanded, his voice a low vibration. The footage slowed. Elias's movement was a blur of economy and power, a terrified display of muscle memory that only decades of elite training could forge. "No civilian moves like this," the chairman murmured, his eyes narrowing. "This is not the work of a street brawler. This is a kinetic signature of a ghost, an operative from a shadow program we have no record of." Min, the lead investigator, stood at attention, his face pale. "His fingerprints don't exist in our national database, sir. His medals are foreign, and his tactical profile matches no known mercenary group in Asia. He lives under a bridge, yet he protects your daughter with the precision of a Praetorian guard." The chairman stood, walking toward the window that overlooked the rain-swept city. To a man who ruled through calculated fear, a man he couldn't identify was a variable he couldn't control. If Elias wasn't a savior, he was a spy, a Trojan horse sent by a foreign power or a rival syndicate to worm his way into Hannah's gratitude. The kindness Elias showed to the dog and the downtrodden was, in the chairman's mind, the perfect cover for a cold-blooded assassin. "The debt of a life is heavy," Kong said, his reflection in the glass looking back with hard, uncompromising eyes. "But the threat of the unknown is heavier. I want to look into the soul of this ghost and see who truly pulls his strings. He turned to his elite recovery team, men who specialize in disappearing targets without a trace. Bring him to the mountain estate. Use whatever level of force is necessary to ensure he arrives. I want my invitation to be one he cannot refuse. The transition from the damp, ozone-heavy air of the slums to the pressurized silence of an armored SUV was instantaneous. Elias didn't resist when the men in tactical gear surrounded his cardboard shelter. He simply stood, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he'd been expecting this summons for a lifetime. He sat in the back of the vehicle, a stark, weathered contrast to the pristine Italian leather seats. His hands, scarred and stained with the grime of the city, rested calmly on his knees as the neon lights of Seoul gave way to the dark, winding roads leading to the chairman's mountain fortress. When the doors opened, he was ushered into a hall of towering glass and cold, white marble. The mountain estate was a monument to absolute power, a billion-dollar cage designed to make any man feel small. Chihuly glass sculptures spiraled toward the ceiling like frozen flames, and the air was filtered to a perfect, scentless chill. Yet, as Elias walked through the gauntlet of stone-faced guards, he didn't look up. He didn't marvel at the original Picassos or the gold-leaf detailing. He walked with the heavy, rhythmic gait of a man who had seen empires burn and knew that marble was just polished dust. He was led into a private study where Chairman Kong waited, framed by a panoramic window that overlooked the sprawling city below. Elias stood in the center of the room, his tattered, salt-stained coat dripping a single, rhythmic trail of rainwater onto the hand-woven silk rug. He looked less like a prisoner and more like a judge. The chairman turned, his eyes scanning the ghost for a flicker of greed, awe, or intimidation. He found none. Elias's gaze remained fixed on a point just past the chairman's shoulder, his expression as unmoving as a granite cliff. With a subtle nod, the chairman signaled an aide, who placed a heavy, silver-latched briefcase on the mahogany desk between them. The latches clicked open with a sound like a gunshot in the silent room. Inside, stacks of high-denomination bills were packed tight, enough wealth to buy 1,000 lives or a clean escape from this one. You saved my daughter, and for that, I owe you a debt, the chairman said, his voice echoing in the vast space. He pushed the case toward the homeless man. Take this. Leave the city tonight. If you are ever seen within these borders again, the debt is settled in blood. The fluorescent lights of the study glinted off the stacks of currency, a mountain of wealth that could buy a dozen mansions in the hills Elias had just traveled. For a long, agonizing minute, the only sound was the hum of the climate control and the slow drip of rainwater from Elias's sleeve. He looked at the money, not with the hunger of a desperate man, but with the weary detachment of someone looking at a pile of dead leaves. Slowly, Elias reached out. His scarred, calloused fingers didn't touch the bills. Instead, they rested on the edge of the silver-latched case. With a deliberate, steady motion, he pushed the fortune back toward the chairman. The heavy briefcase slid across the polished mahogany with a hollow sound that seemed to mock the silence of the room. I have no use for your paper, Elias said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that carried the weight of a desert wind. He finally met the chairman's gaze, his eyes hard and unyielding as flint. I didn't pull her from the river because of who her father was. I didn't save her for a reward. I saved her because she was dying, and no soul deserves to go into the dark alone. The chairman's composure wavered for the briefest of moments. In his world, everyone had a price. Mercy was a currency, and gratitude was a contract. To be met with refusal of this magnitude was an insult to his very philosophy of power. He moved to speak, to offer more, to threaten, but Elias cut him off with sudden, sharp clarity. Elias stepped forward, the distance between the predator and the ghost vanishing. Despite his tattered rags, he seemed to tower over the desk. You have something of mine, he said, the air in the room suddenly thickening with a dormant, lethal energy. The leather pouch. My daughter's photograph. My life. The chairman instinctively tightened his grip on the arms of his chair. He had seen generals tremble in this room, yet this man, this ghost from the gutters, was issuing an ultimatum. Return to me now, Elias whispered, his voice dropping to a dangerous, vibrating octave. Or I will stop being a guest in your home, and I will take it back myself. And you know as well as I do, Chairman, Your walls aren't thick enough to keep me out. The tension in the study was a physical weight. A thin cord stretched to the point of snapping. Before the chairman's security could close the distance, the heavy oak doors drifted open. Hannah stepped into the light, her face pale but her gaze resolute. In her hands, she clutched the weathered leather pouch as if it were a sacred relic. She walked past the guards, past her father's outstretched hand, and stopped directly in front of Elias. "It belongs to you," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her fingers. "I'm sorry we kept it." As she handed the pouch back, the worn flap fell open, revealing a small sepia-toned photograph tucked behind a clear plastic sleeve. Hannah's eyes caught the image and she froze. The man in the photo was undeniably Elias, but he was decades younger, clad in a crisp, dark green medic's uniform. He wasn't alone. Standing beside him, gripped in a firm, brotherly handshake, was a young man with a familiar, sharp jawline, a man who now stood only a few feet away in this very room. Hannah looked up, her gaze shifting to her father's oldest advisor, Master Park. Park had been the architect of the Kong Syndicate's rise, a man of iron nerves who had survived 3 decades of underworld warfare. But as Hannah held the photo toward the light, the color drained from Park's face. His hands, usually as steady as a surgeon's, began to shake. He took a stumbling step forward, his eyes locked on the image of the young medic. The silence in the room became absolute, broken only by the ragged sound of the advisor's breathing. He looked from the photo to the scarred, tattered man standing in the center of the marble floor, and for the first time in 30 years, the great Master Park looked terrified. "It can't be," Park whispered, his voice cracking like dry parchment. He looked at Chairman Kong, his eyes wide with a haunting ancestral dread. "Sir, you don't understand who you have brought into this house. This man isn't just a soldier. He's the shadow of Gwangju. He's a ghost from the 92 riots." Hannah returned to the bridge not as an heiress, but as a student of a world she had spent her life driving past in tinted limousines. The roar of the traffic above was a constant, rhythmic thunder, but beneath the concrete spans, Elias moved with a quiet, purposeful grace. He didn't offer her a chair. He simply gestured for her to sit on a sun-bleached milk crate and watch. "You see a crowd," Elias said, his voice barely audible over the rush of the river. "You see the dirt and the noise. But look closer, Hannah. Look at the hands." He pointed to a woman in a tattered coat, sorting through a mountain of plastic bottles. She was a schoolteacher before the crash of '08. She still organizes her recycling by the weight and grade, a habit of a mind that loves order. She isn't begging. She's auditing the city's waste. He shifted his gaze to a man sharpening a dull pocket knife on a smooth river stone. That man was a master carpenter. He lost his shop, but his hands still remember the grain of the wood. They aren't homeless. They are people whose stories were cut short by someone else's greed. For hours, Hannah sat in the shadows, her expensive boots gathering the fine gray dust of the underpass. Elias taught her the language of forgotten, how a specific chalk mark on a pillar meant a safe place to sleep, and how a shared cigarette was a silent contract of mutual protection. For the first time, the Ice Princess felt the coldness of her own life melting away. These people weren't threats to be managed. They were a community held together by the invisible threads of survival and dignity. As the sun began to dip below the skyline, casting long, skeletal shadows across the dirt, a flash of light caught Hannah's eye. High up on the embankment, parked in a service turnout where no cars were permitted, sat a sleek, black sedan. Its windows were an impenetrable obsidian, reflecting the dying orange light. From the passenger side, a long, high-definition lens protruded just an inch from the cracked window, its cold glass eye fixed directly on them. It wasn't the syndicate security, and it wasn't the police. As the car's engine purred into life and it vanished in the flow of traffic, Hannah felt a sudden, sharp chill that had nothing to do with the evening breeze. The morning sun struggled to pierce the gray smog hanging over the Han River. But for the first time in years, the sounds of the slums were different. There were no heavy boots of city collectors or the rumbling of demolition cranes. Instead, men in charcoal suits stood at the perimeter of the bridge, their presence a silent, immovable wall. Hannah arrived not in a motorcade, but on foot, carrying a heavy folder embossed with the city's official seal. She found Elias where he always was, sitting on a rusted crate, his eyes fixed on a slow, murky pull of the tide, with a smile that she meant to be a shield. She knelt beside him. "It's over, Elias," she whispered, laying the documents on the dirt between them. "The developers, the police sweeps, the threats, they can't touch this place anymore. I bought it. The bridge, the banks, the 5 blocks surrounding it. It's all under the calm foundation now. You're safe." She expected a flicker of relief, perhaps even the ghost of a thank you. Instead, the air around Elias seemed to turn to ice. He didn't look at the deed. He looked at the men in suits standing where the neighborhood children usually played. His jaw tightened, a muscle leaping in his weathered cheek, like a trapped nerve. Slowly he stood, and for the first time, the warmth Hannah had felt his presence vanished, replaced by a cold, radiating fury. He didn't see a gift. He saw a flag. By saving this patch of dirt, Hannah had painted a giant, golden target over every soul living beneath the concrete. "You think you've given me a sanctuary?" Elias's voice was a low, dangerous vibration that made the fine hairs on Hannah's neck stand up. He gestured to the black SUVs idling at the edge of the slums, their tinted windows reflecting the misery they were meant to protect. He stepped toward her, his shadow falling long and dark over the legal papers. "You didn't buy my safety, Hannah. You bought a battlefield. In your father's world, a gift is just a signature on a death warrant. By putting your name on this bridge, you've told every enemy your father ever made exactly where to find his heart." In the cold, clinical glow of the syndicate's secondary headquarters, Yuri, the chairman's ambitious protege, watched the surveillance feed with a predatory scowl. To the chairman, Elias was a debt of honor. To Yuri, he was a chaotic variable, a ghost whose influence over Hannah was eroding the firm, fearful foundation of their empire. Yuri didn't believe in legends or ghosts of Gwangju. He believed in the crushing weight of the law and the stain of a reputation. "If we cannot kill him without the chairman's wrath," Yuri whispered to his men, his voice as sharp as a razor, "we will make the city vomit him out." Under the shroud of a moonless midnight, Yuri's agents moved into the silence of the underpass. They didn't carry blades or silenced pistols. Instead, they moved with surgical stealth, tucking small, vacuum-sealed bricks of high-grade narcotics into the seams of Elias's cardboard shelter and beneath the rusted crates of neighboring families. It was enough to trigger a mandatory life sentence, a betrayal that would turn the entire community against their protector in a single heartbeat. By dawn, the rhythmic thrum of the bridge was shattered by the harsh, staccato pulse of red and blue lights. A dozen tactical police units swarmed the embankment, their boots heavy on the gravel, their rifles leveled at the shadows. They moved with the frantic energy of a tip-off that promised a major bust. The lead officer kicked open the entryway to Elias's makeshift home, shouting for the ghost to surrender. But the space was hollow. The cardboard was gone. The blankets were missing. The narcotics Yuri had planted were nowhere to be found, as if the very earth had swallowed the evidence of the frame-up. As the officers began a frustrated search of the riverbank, they found only one thing in the center of the meticulously swept dirt where Elias's bed had been. Resting on a flat stone, positioned exactly where a king would stand on a board, was a single hand-carved wooden chess piece. A white knight, its face scarred and its base weighted with lead. The smell of damp concrete and cheap rubbing alcohol hit Hannah long before she reached the bottom of the rusted service stairs. Following the cryptic chalk marks Elias had taught her, she navigated the bowels of an abandoned textile factory, 3 levels below the bustling streets of Seoul. She expected to find him hiding from Yuri's frame-up. Instead, she found a sanctuary. In a small, windowless room illuminated by the flickering hum of a jury-rigged generator, Elias stood over a makeshift surgical table. He had traded his tattered coat for a clean, albeit faded, scrub top. His hands, the same hands that had dismantled assassins with a soup ladle, were now moving with a grace that was almost prayer-like. He was stitching a jagged gash on the shoulder of a trembling teenager, a delivery boy who had clearly been a victim of a hit-and run. Hannah stood in the doorway, her breath hitching. The room was lined with salvaged metal shelving packed with expired but sterile antibiotics, rolls of gauze, and glass jars of traditional herbs. This wasn't a hideout. It was a ghost hospital. Elias wasn't just a man living under a bridge. He was the primary care physician for a city that refused to look at him. He was the only one who didn't ask for an ID or a credit card before stopping a bleed. "You're late for your lesson," Elias said without looking up, his voice steady as he tied off a suture. "The boy needs water. Top shelf blue jug." Hannah moved instinctively. Her role as an heiress forgotten as she became a nurse in his shadow. She saw the exhaustion etched into the deep lines of his face, the silent toll of a man who spent his nights saving lives and his days being hunted by them. For a few minutes, the world was quiet, reduced to the rhythmic snip of surgical scissors and the boy's steadying breath. Then, the humming generator let out a choked, mechanical rattle and died. The room plunged into a suffocating, absolute darkness. Before Hannah could even gasp, the heavy iron door at the top of the stairs was kicked inward with sound like a thunderclap. The beam of a high-powered tactical light cut through the blackness, sweeping the room with cold, predatory intent. "The chairman wants his guest back." A voice barked, followed by the metallic slide of a round being chambered. "And Yuri wants a girl." The darkness was not an obstacle for Elias. It was an old friend. While the intruders fumbled with their high-lumen tactical lights, blinding themselves against the white-tiled walls of the laboratory, Elias's hand found Hannah's wrist. His grip was a grounding force, cool, steady, and certain. He didn't whisper a command. He simply moved, pulling her into the rhythmic silence of a world beneath the world. "Keep your head low," he breathed, his voice a ghost in her ear. "Step where I step. Do not breathe through your mouth." They slipped through a rusted ventilation grate that Hannah hadn't even noticed in the light. Beyond lay the city's true nervous system, a labyrinth of Victorian-era brick sewers and forgotten maintenance tunnels that predated the subway. Elias moved with a terrifying familiarity, navigating by the feel of the air's current and the specific resonance of the overhead traffic. Above them, the city hummed, oblivious to the hunt occurring in its veins. Behind them, the heavy thud of tactical boots echoed against the damp stone. Yuri's men weren't just guards. They were trackers, guided by thermal sensors that cut through the gloom. A red laser that danced across the mossy ceiling, searching for a heart to stop. "They're closing in," Hannah whispered, her lungs burning from the stagnant, sulphurous air. "Not yet," Elias replied. He shoved her behind a thick concrete pillar as a volley of suppressed gunfire hissed through the dark, chipping shards of stone that stung her cheeks. The mercenaries were firing blindly into the corridor, creating a wall of lead. Elias didn't retreat. He stepped into the gap, shielding Hannah with the sheer breadth of his frame. He was a human bulkhead, absorbing the geometry of the tunnel to ensure not a single ricochet could reach her. A sharp, wet thwack echoed in the confined space, the unmistakable sound of metal meeting flesh. Hannah felt Elias's body recoil slightly, a sudden tension rippling through his shoulder where her hand rested. She waited for a cry of pain, the gasp of agony, or the collapse that usually followed such a strike. But there was only silence. Elias didn't flinch. He didn't groan. He simply shifted his weight, his breathing remaining as rhythmic and cold as the water dripping from the ceiling. He turned his head slightly, his eyes catching a stray glint of light, showing a terrifying, glassy focus. "Keep moving," he said, his voice completely unchanged, though a dark, spreading heat began to soak into the fabric of his scrub top against her palm. The neon pulse of the city felt like a fevered dream as Hannah steered the unmarked sedan into the hidden garage of a high-rise penthouse, a safe house her father kept for the ghosts of his own past. Elias leaned heavily against the passenger door, his face the color of winter ash, the dark stain on his shoulder now a wide, glistening map of his sacrifice. He hadn't uttered a single groan during the frantic drive, but his breathing had grown shallow, a ragged whistle in the silence of the car. Inside the sterile, stainless steel kitchen of the safe house, Hannah scrambled for the emergency medical kit. Her hands, usually reserved for turning the pages of delicate ledgers or holding crystal flutes, were shaking so violently she could barely snap the seal on the lid. I have to call a doctor. I can't do this," she stammered, her voice breaking as she looked at the jagged entry wound. "No doctors," Elias rasped, his eyes snapping open with a terrifying, lucid clarity. He sat upright on a bar stool, his back straight despite the trauma. "The syndicate monitors every licensed surgeon in this zip code. You do it. Now!" Under his low, rhythmic direction, The world narrowed down to the glint of a curved needle and the smell of iodine. Elias walked her through the nightmare with the detachment of a professor. He talked her through the local anesthetic, the probing for the slug, and the delicate tension of the sutures. He watched his own blood bloom against the white counter without a blink, his voice never rising, even when the forceps gripped the lead. "Pull!" he commanded, his jaw tense into a block of granite. "Don't look away, Hannah. To save a life, you have to be willing to see the red." As the bullet finally clinked into a glass bowl, the adrenaline that had sustained him began to evaporate. His head lolled back against the cold tile wall, his eyelids fluttering as the blood loss finally claimed his consciousness. Hannah leaned in, pressing a clean bandage to his shoulder, her tears finally falling hot and fast onto his skin. "Elias, stay with me," she whispered, her heart hammering. His lips moved, barely a breath, a sound so faint she had to press her ear to his mouth to catch it. It wasn't a plea for mercy or a prayer for the dead. "Don't let them find us," he murmured, his voice drifting into a dark, distant place. "Not yet, Junho." Hannah froze, the needle slipping from her numb fingers. Junho wasn't a title. It wasn't a code. It was her father's birth name, a name buried 30 years ago under the weight of the Kong Syndicate, known only to those who had walked through the fire with him before the world turned to gold. The sound of the safe house elevator's mechanical hum was a herald of judgment. Hannah stood over the kitchen island, her hands still stained with the copper-scented reality of the surgery, as the doors slid open to reveal her father. Chairman Kong did not enter with his usual entourage of muscle. He came alone, his presence filling the sterile, high-tech room with a cold, suffocating gravity. His eyes immediately fell on the bloody basin, the discarded bullet, and finally, the pale, unconscious man draped across a recliner in the corner. "You risked everything for a ghost, Hannah," the chairman said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "Yuri's men are scouring the city. You have brought the war into our private sanctuary." He walked toward the sleeping man, his leather shoes clicking rhythmically against the marble. Hannah stepped between them, her jaw set in defiance. "He took a bullet meant for me, Father. He didn't ask who I was. He didn't ask for a price. He just stood in the way." The chairman brushed past her, his gaze fixed on the tattered scrub-top Hannah had cut away to reach the wound. As he leaned over the unconscious Elias, his hand paused in midair, tucked into the waist of Elias's trousers. Partially revealed by the movement of the surgery, was a chain of dull, tarnished metal. Kong reached out, his fingers trembling as he pulled the object into the light. It was a set of old, notched dog tags, the edges smoothed by decades of friction against skin. The chairman's breath hitched, a sound of pure, unadulterated shock that Hannah had never heard in her life. He stared at the serial number, his eyes tracing the name etched into the steel, a name that seemed to pull him back 30 years into a world of smoke, fire, and a debt that had never been repaid. The chairman stood frozen, the silence in the penthouse becoming absolute. He looked at the scarred shoulder, the graying hair, and the weary lines of the man the world called a vagrant. Slowly, with a deliberate, agonizing grace, the most powerful man in the Korean underworld stepped back. He didn't offer a command. He didn't reach for his phone. Instead, he straightened his silk suit, placed his hands at his sides, and folded his body into a perfect 90-degree bow, a gesture of total, absolute submission and respect usually reserved for an emperor or a god, to the sleeping homeless man. The air in the safe house seemed to thicken with the scent of old smoke and spent brass as the chairman's gaze drifted toward the darkened window. In his mind, the sleek skyscrapers of modern Seoul dissolved into the chaotic, blood-slicked streets of 1992. The Gwangju riots were a furnace that forged men or broke them, and a young Junho, long before he was a chairman, lay die in a gutter, his stomach torn open by shrapnel, his brothers in arms already scattered by the advancing military police. Elias had appeared through the tear gas like a phantom, his medic's vest glowing white against the orange flickers of the burning city. He hadn't asked for Junho's political affiliation or the name of his gang. He had simply knelt in the glass, his hand steady as he performed a field surgery that defied the logic of the battlefield. When the police line surged forward, Elias didn't flee to save himself. He dragged the criminal into a boarded-up clinic, using his own body as a shield against the batons. The cost of that mercy was total. By morning, The authorities had labeled Elias a collaborator for treating a high-value insurgent. His medical license was revoked, his reputation incinerated, and his future erased from the official records of the state. He had traded a brilliant surgical career for the life of a nameless dying boy in a leather jacket. He chose a gutter so that Jun-ho could one day sit on a throne. The chairman finally straightened from his bow, his eyes glistening with rare, terrifying vulnerability. He looked at Hannah, who stood paralyzed by the weight of a history she had never been permitted to know. The man on the recliner wasn't just a savior from a car wreck. He was the architect of the Kong Syndicate's very existence. "I spent 30 years building an empire out of shadow and steel," the chairman whispered, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch the edge of Elias's tattered sleeve. "I call myself a king, but I am merely a tenant in a house built by a better man's ruin." He turned to his daughter, his voice breaking into a jagged rasp. "Everything I own, this building, our name, the very breath of my lungs, is because of his mercy." The sanctuary of the penthouse was shattered not by a knock, but by the synchronized kill code of the building's own security system. The lights flickered from a warm amber to a rhythmic, pulsing crimson. Yuri had not merely followed them. He had waited for the chairman to be vulnerable, isolated by his own sentimentality. Outside, the silent elevators groaned as they were overridden by tactical overrides, and the heavy reinforced glass of the balcony vibrated with the approach of a blacked-out helicopter. "My apologies, Chairman." Yuri's voice crackled over the intercom, stripped of its usual subservience. "But a king who bows to a beggar is a king who has already lost his crown. The syndicate needs a wolf, not a mourner." Before the chairman could reach the concealed firearm beneath the marble counter, the doors to the private suite were blown inward by a focused thermite charge. Smoke, thick and acrid, flooded the room. Through the haze, a dozen of Yuri's elite silver guards swarmed in, their silent submachine guns trained on the chairman's heart. Hannah screamed as a gloved hand clamped over her mouth, dragging her toward the shattered entrance. "Let her go," the chairman roared, his voice cracking with a desperation he had never known in 30 years of war. He moved along, but a rifle butt to the ribs sent him crashing to his knees. He watched helpless, as Yuri stepped through the smoke, adjusting his cufflinks with chilling, clinical calm. "She is the only leverage I need to ensure the board votes my way tonight," Yuri sneered, looking down at his former mentor. He signaled his men to zip-tie the chairman's wrists. "Stay here and reflect on your mercy, while I rebuild what you've allowed to rot." Yuri's gaze drifted to the corner of the room, to the recliner where the ghost had been resting. His plan included a final, messy execution of the witness who had started it all. He leveled his pistol at the shadow beneath the medical monitors, ready to end the legend of 1992 once and for all. But as the smoke cleared, Yuri's finger froze on the trigger. The recliner was empty. The 4-line lay hissed on the floor, trailing a single, fresh drop of blood onto the white rug. The ghost was gone, leaving behind only the cold, open window and a haunting silence that suggested the predator had just become the prey. The penthouse, once a monument to architectural transparency, had become a graveyard of shadows. Yuri's men moved in tight, 3-man stacks, their night vision goggles humming with a high-pitched whine. They were the apex predators of the corporate underworld. Yet as they swept the darkened corridors, they found only the echoes of their own breathing. The first man vanished in the library. There was no gunshot, no struggle, only the soft, rhythmic rustle of a silk curtain. When his partner turned, the space was empty, save for a single, hand-carved wooden chess piece resting on a blood-spattered Hemingway First Edition. The second man was taken in the kitchen, pulled into the industrial walk-in freezer by a hand that moved with the silent, irresistible force of tide. Elias did not fight like a soldier. He fought like the wind. He used the very invisibility that had allowed him to survive on the streets for decades. The ability to be seen but never noticed, to blend into the architecture of neglect. He moved through the ventilation shafts and service conduits, a blood-stained ghost in a tattered scrub top, to the mercenaries. He was everywhere and nowhere, a primal force reclaiming the golden cage for the man who had built it. Yuri stood in the center of the grand ballroom, his breath coming in jagged hitches. The sophisticated tactical radio on his vest had fallen silent, replaced by the statics of dead air. He gripped his pistol with white-knuckled desperation, spinning at every creak of the floorboards. "Show yourself!" he screamed, the sound echoing hollowly off the vaulted ceilings. "You're nothing but a relic, a man of the dirt." From the absolute blackness behind a marble pillar, Elias stepped into the pale moonlight. He was pale, his shoulders soaked in fresh crimson, but his eyes held a terrifying, ancient stillness. He didn't raise a weapon. He simply walked toward Yuri, his footsteps heavy and rhythmic. The sound of the debt finally coming due. Yuri backed away, his heel catching on the edge of the sunken lounge. As Elias cornered him against the panoramic glass, Yuri's face twisted into a manic, desperate grin. He didn't reach for his gun. Instead, he reached into his breast pocket and produced a small, matte black transmitter with a single, glowing red toggle. "One more step, old man," Yuri hissed, his thumb hovering over the switch. "The foundations of this building are rigged with enough C4 to level the block. If my heart stops, or if you touch me, the Ice Princess and her father go up in a pillar of fire." The smell of ozone and sulfur thickened as a series of muffled detonations rocked the penthouse's lower levels. Black, oily smoke began to curl from the vents, a serpent rising to claim the high-rise. Yuri's thumb hovered over the final detonator, his eyes wide with manic, cornered light. "The service elevator," Yuri hissed, gesturing toward the flickering lights of the kitchen. "I jammed the doors and ignited the fuel lines. Your friends, the maids, the cooks, the people you love so much, are screaming in a steel oven. If you come for me, they burn." Elias stood in the center of the grand ballroom, the weight of 30 years of war settling into his bones. He looked at Yuri, a man who viewed human lives as mere static in a power struggle, and then he looked toward the kitchen. Through the rising haze, he heard it. Not the roar of the syndicate, but the frantic, rhythmic hammering of a woman's fist against a reinforced door and the high, thin wail of a terrified kitchen porter. For a heartbeat, the shadow of Gwangju lived up to his name. His muscles coiled, his scarred hands twitching with the primal urge to close the distance and end Yuri's existence. It would be easy. A single strike to the throat, a cold finality to the traitor's reign. But as the first orange lick of flame danced across the silk wallpaper, Elias saw a reflection of the 1992 riots in glass, a younger version of himself choosing a dying boy over a medal. Elias's gaze went cold, but it wasn't the coldness of a killer. It was a chilling, absolute clarity of a medic. Without a word, he turned his back on Yuri. He ignored the open path to the villain and the silver latch case of evidence. He sprinted toward the wall of fire, his tattered scrub top billowing like a flag of surrender to his own vengeance. Yuri let out a jagged, hysterical laugh, his boots clicking against the marble as he scrambled toward the balcony's private helipad. "You fool! You're choosing the dirt again!" he screamed over his shoulder. Elias didn't look back. He plunged into the inferno, his silhouette swallowed by the smoke as he swung a heavy fire axe toward the jammed elevator doors. He was letting the architect of the coup walk free into the night, trading his only chance at justice for the lives of the people the world had forgotten to count. The roar of the helicopter's rotors whipped the rain into a frenzied mist as Yuri reached the lower service entrance of the building. He had abandoned the helipad, sensing the heat of the fire rising too fast, and opted for the armored transport waiting in the alley. His chest heaved with a manic triumph. He had the detonator. The girl was in a secondary van, and the ghost was likely currently suffocating in a tomb of his own making. "Drive," Yuri screamed, slamming his fist against the partition of the black SUV. "Move, or I'll have your head." But the vehicle didn't move. It sat idling, its headlights cutting through the downpour to reveal a sight that defied the logic of the syndicate's power. At the mouth of the narrow alley, a wall had formed. It wasn't a wall of steel or stone, but of flesh and tattered wool. Dozens of men and women, the very invisibles Elias had taught Hannah to see, stood shoulder to shoulder. They held no guns, only the rusted pipes of their scavenged lives and the quiet, immovable weight of their presence. Beyond them, hundreds more began to pour from the shadows of the subway vents and the hollows of the bridge. They didn't shout, they didn't throw stones. They simply stood there, an ocean of forgotten blocking every exit, every side street, and every sewer grate. Yuri leaped from the car, his pistol shaking in his hand. "Out of the way, you filth! I will mow you down!" He fired a shot into the air, but the line didn't break. The schoolteacher from the recycling pile didn't flinch. The carpenter stepped forward, his eyes reflecting the cold neon of the city. For the first time, Yuri realized that while he owned the heights, Elias owned the foundation. A heavy, rhythmic step echoed from the darkness behind the crowd. The sea of people parted with silent, reverent grace, revealing a figure silhouetted by the orange glow of the distant fire. Elias stepped into the light, his face smeared with soot, his wounded shoulder bound in a scorched kitchen apron. He looked at Yuri not with hatred, but with a terrifying, absolute pity. "You spent your life looking up at the penthouse, Yuri," Elias said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to come from the earth itself. "You forgot to look at the shadows. The city has eyes, and tonight they are all watching you." The rain continued to wash the soot from the pavement as the syndicate's sirens finally faded into the hum of the city. Yuri had been taken away not by the police, but by the silent, judging hands of the men he had spent his life stepping over. In the wreckage of the grand ballroom, where the fire had been contained but the opulence was forever charred, Chairman Kong stood amidst the ruins of his legacy. He looked at Elias, the man who had saved his staff, his daughter, and his very soul, and saw the only pillar left standing. "My empire is a house of glass," the chairman said, his voice stripped of its usual iron. He gestured to the rows of black-suited guards who now stood with their heads bowed, ashamed of the treachery they had allowed to fester. Yuri was right about one thing. The syndicate needs a new kind of strength. It needs a conscience. It needs a man who can see the shadows before they turn into daggers. The chairman stepped forward, offering a heavy, golden boss key that represented the keys to his kingdom. The leadership of the security wing, a position that controlled 1,000 of eyes and ears that kept the Kong family in power. "Take it, Elias. Stop living in the dirt. Command my men. Protect my daughter from the inside. You are the only one I trust to hold the sword." Hannah watched from the doorway, her breath held. She saw the conflict in Elias's eyes, the pull of the quiet, invisible life he had led against the sudden, heavy burden of a throne. For 30 years, he had been a ghost, a healer in the dark. To accept this was to step into the blinding, dangerous light of the world that had once discarded him. Elias looked at the gold key, then at the scarred palms of his own hands. He reached out and closed his fingers around the metal. The weight of it was immense, a rhythmic pulse of power that could either heal or crush. "I will take the position," Elias said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to settle the very dust of the room. He met the chairman's gaze with an intensity that made the older man recoil. "But I do not work for your gold, and I will not lead your soldiers. I accept, but only on one condition. A condition that will tear down the walls of the syndicate and change the meaning of your name forever." The steel and glass monolith that once housed the Kong Syndicate's intelligence wing did not fall to demolition crews. It fell to a different kind of revolution. Within weeks of Elias taking the helm, the cold, obsidian lettering of the corporate logo was stripped from the facade. In its place, etched in simple, unadorned granite, were the words, "The Elias Foundation." The transformation was not merely aesthetic. It was a rhythmic, systemic dismantling of a dark empire. The fleet of black SUVs, once symbols of intimidation that made the city's heart stutter, no longer idle in the shadows of government buildings. Their tinted windows remained, but their cargo had changed. Now, the heavy rear door swung open to reveal stacks of refrigerated insulin, high-grade antibiotics, and trauma kits. The stone-faced men in suits were still there, but their earpieces were tuned to the logistics of mercy. They moved through the slums not as wolves, but as a literal lifeline. Delivering invisible medicine Elias had once scavenged to the doorsteps of those the city had long since abandoned. Hannah stood in the center of the redesigned lobby, watching a group of neighborhood children marvel at a fountain that had once been a barrier. The air no longer smelled of cold tobacco and filtered tension. It smelled of ozone, fresh rain, and the faint, clean scent of antiseptic. Her father, the chairman, stood beside her, his hands tucked into his pockets, looking like a man who had finally put down a weight he had carried for 30 years. "He didn't just save us, Hannah," the chairman whispered, his gaze following Elias as he walked among the staff, still wearing his weathered, salt-stained boots beneath his new trousers. "He gave us a way to be remembered for something other than the scars we left." Later that evening, In the quiet of the Foundation's private archives, Hannah sat with Elias's old leather pouch. She had been cleaning the grit from the seams, a rhythmic task of gratitude, when her thumb brushed against a thickness in the lining she hadn't noticed before. It wasn't a tear, but a deliberate, expert seam hidden behind the photograph of the young medic. With a trembling hand, she pulled a small silver thread. A hidden compartment slid open, revealing a folded, yellow document and a second photograph, one that had never been shown to her father or the world. As she unfolded the paper, her breath hitched, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. It wasn't a military record or a medical license. It was a birth certificate from a provincial hospital in 1993, and the name listed under Father made the world around her tilt into a terrifying new reality. The yellowed paper in Hannah's hands didn't just feel like old parchment. It felt like a living, breathing confession. As she smoothed the creases, the birth certificate revealed a truth that silenced the very air in the archive. There, in the faded ink of a 1993 provincial clinic, was her own name, not as a con, but as a child of the medic who had just rebuilt her world. Beside the document lay the second photograph, a small, candid shot of Elias, younger and unscarred, holding a bundle wrapped in a tattered wool blanket. The baby in his arms had the same unmistakable arc of the brow, the same defiant set of jaw that Hannah saw in the mirror every morning. The rhythmic ticking of the wall clock seemed to amplify as the door behind her creaked open. Elias stood there, framed by the soft amber light of the hallway. He didn't look surprised to see the secret compartment open. He looked like a man who had finally reached the end of a very long, very cold journey. "You weren't supposed to find that until I was truly a ghost," he said, his voice a low, melodic rasp that carried the weight of 3 decades of silence. Hannah stood, the paper trembling in her grasp. "My father, the chairman, he thinks he found me in an orphanage after the riots. He thinks he saved me from the gutter." Elias stepped into the room, his shadow stretching across the marble floor to touch her feet. He looked at the photo of the baby, his eyes softening with a grief so profound it made Hannah's chest ache. "Junho didn't find you, Hannah. I brought you to him. I watched from the shadows as his men picked up the basket. I left on the steps of his compound. I knew he was a man of blood, but I also knew he was a man of honor. He had the power to give you a name, a home, and a future that a disgraced medic in a war zone never could." He took a slow, heavy breath, his gaze meeting hers with an intensity that burned. "I didn't lose my daughter to the dark, Hannah. I gave her away to the light. I became a ghost so that you would never have to know the smell of smoke or the weight of a debt." The grand ballroom of the Elias Foundation was no longer a fortress of cold secrets, but a sanctuary of light. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, rhythmic glow over a crowd that had never before shared the same air. High-ranking ministers stood in conversation with the very street vendors who had once occupied the shadows of their offices. The scent of expensive lilies mingled with the clean, honest smell of rain from the open balcony, a sensory reminder that the world outside was no longer a place to be feared. In the center of the hall, Elias stood tall. He had traded his salt-stained rags for a charcoal gray suit that fit his broad shoulders with natural, understated dignity. He didn't look like a man playing a part. He looked like a man who had finally reclaimed his skin. Beside him, Hannah wore a gown of deep emerald, her hand tucked firmly into the crook of his arm. To the onlookers, they were the visionary leader and the reformed heiress. But to the two of them, the silence between their footsteps held the weight of 30 years of unspoken prayers. Chairman Kong approached them, his steps measured and slow. He looked at Elias, not as a ghost or a debtor, but as the brother he had never deserved. He saw the way Hannah leaned into Elias's strength, and for the first time, the chairman's eyes held a peaceful, unburdened light. The syndicate was gone, replaced by something that didn't need blood to survive. Elias stepped toward the balcony, looking out over the Seoul skyline. The Han River flowed below, a dark, silver ribbon that had once nearly claimed his daughter and had ultimately given him back his life. He realized then that kindness was never a transaction to be balanced or a debt to be collected. It was a seed, planted in the mud of a riot or the cold of a river, that had grown into a forest wide enough to shelter an entire city. He turned back to Hannah, his eyes reflecting the soft lights of the gala and the fierce, protective love of a father who had finally come home. He squeezed her hand, a rhythmic pulse of certainty. The circle had closed, not with a strike of a blade, but with the quiet, persistent power of a heart that refused to forget